Tonight, we will tell you a story of medieval customs, where the most intimate of moments often unfolded as a public spectacle, and where rules, both written and unwritten, deeply influenced the beginning of a marriage. You will learn how weddings were intricate legal and social contracts, often more focused on alliances than personal affection. You will discover why the wedding night itself was rarely private, and how the church, the Lord, and ancient superstitions all played a part in what happened behind closed doors. We will explore the bizarre rituals meant to ensure fertility, the legal loopholes that could end a marriage before it truly began, and the enduring myths that still echo through history. This is a glimpse into a world where every aspect of life, even love and intimacy, was bound by unseen threads of custom and power. Oh, and if you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Your support helps us to continue bringing these forgotten tales to life, offering new sleep stories every day. All right, find a comfortable spot, settle in, and let your mind drift back to a time when vows were made and destinies were sealed through a complex web of rules. Our journey begins long before the wedding feast, in a world where marriage was often about strategy, with personal choice playing a very limited role. Tonight, we delve into a world where love stories were rarely the foundation of a marriage, a time when unions were forged not by affection, but by calculation and necessity. We are stepping back into the heart of the Middle Ages, a period spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, a complex tapestry of feudal lords, devout peasants, and powerful monarchs, where every aspect of life, including matrimony, was intertwined with survival and status. In this era, the concept of marriage, as you might understand it today, was fundamentally different. It was less about the individual hearts involved and far more about the strategic consolidation of family power, the expansion of influence, and the meticulous management of wealth and land. Imagine a sprawling medieval estate, perhaps a great castle with its surrounding villages and fields, the very lifeblood of a noble house. For the ruling elite, the landed gentry, and even ambitious merchants, marriage was the most potent tool in their political and economic arsenal. When a powerful family sought a match for their son or daughter, their considerations were rarely the charm or kindness of the prospective spouse. Instead, their gaze would fall upon maps, upon ledgers, upon family trees, searching for the perfect alignment of territories, the opportune infusion of wealth, or the crucial strengthening of political ties. A marriage could end a long-standing feud, secure a vulnerable border, or unite two powerful houses against a common foe. It was, in essence, a peace treaty, a business merger, and a political alliance, all rolled into one binding ceremony. The primary driver, especially for the nobility, was land. Land was power, the source of all wealth and authority in a feudal society. A lord's standing was measured by the acreage he controlled, the number of vassals who swore fealty to him, and the resources his estates could yield. Therefore, marrying an heiress who brought with her vast tracts of fertile land or strategically important castles was a prize beyond measure, far more valuable than any personal compatibility. Conversely, a daughter could be given in marriage to secure a claim on disputed territory or to ensure that a family's holdings did not fragment through inheritance laws. The dowry, a transfer of property or money from the bride's family to the groom or his family upon marriage, was a vital component of this land-based economy. It was not merely a gift, it was often a significant portion of the bride's inheritance, meant to secure her position within her new family and to contribute to the financial well-being of the union. In return, the bride was often promised a dower, a portion of the husband's estate set aside for her support should she become a widow. These were not romantic gestures, but pragmatic agreements, meticulously outlined in lengthy legal documents, sometimes years before the actual wedding. Beyond land, wealth played a crucial role. This might manifest as ready coin, valuable goods, trade rights, or control over lucrative resources like mines or forests. A marriage could bring a much-needed financial injection to a struggling noble house, or it could solidify a merchant family's position by linking them to aristocratic prestige. For the burgeoning merchant class, whose wealth was often liquid rather than tied to land, marriages were equally strategic, allowing them to expand their trade networks, gain access to new markets, or forge alliances that protected their commercial interests. These unions were often sealed with substantial dowries, reflecting the fluid nature of their capital. Imagine the negotiations taking place in dimly lit counting houses, the rustle of parchment, the careful calculation of assets, as families weighed the balance of gold and influence. Then there was the pursuit of power itself, political influence, social standing, and military strength. A king might marry his daughter to a powerful duke to prevent rebellion or to secure military aid. A duke might marry his son to a countess to elevate his family's standing at court. These unions created intricate webs of kinship and obligation that stretched across kingdoms, shaping the political landscape for generations. They could bring peace to warring factions, or they could, conversely, escalate minor disputes into full-blown conflicts if alliances shifted or failed. For a young man or woman born into such a family, their individual desires or preferences were almost entirely secondary to these grand dynastic ambitions. They were pawns on a vast chessboard, moved by their parents or guardians to achieve larger objectives. The idea of marrying for love, while not entirely absent from medieval thought, was largely confined to ballads and poetry, a romantic ideal that rarely translated into the harsh realities of aristocratic matchmaking. The decision-making process for these marriages rested almost entirely with the heads of the families, typically the fathers, or if they were absent, the eldest male relatives. A young man or woman would have little, if any, say in the choice of their spouse. From an early age, children were often aware that their future was not their own to determine. Daughters, in particular, were seen as valuable commodities, their marriages being a means to secure alliances or perpetuate the family line. They were raised with an understanding that their primary duty was to produce heirs, especially male heirs, to ensure the continuation of the family name and its holdings. This was not a cruel practice in their eyes, but simply the accepted order of their world, a reflection of societal structures that prioritize collective survival and dynastic continuity over individual happiness. Even for those lower down the social ladder, though the scale of the stakes was smaller, the principles often remained. A peasant family might seek a spouse for their child from a neighboring village to gain access to more land, to share labor, or simply to strengthen communal ties. While personal affection might have a greater chance to blossom in these less formal arrangements, the economic realities of survival still often dictated the choice. A good match meant more hands for the harvest, more mouths to feed, but also potentially more security for the future. The process of arranging these unions was often protracted and complex. It began with negotiations between emissaries, who would carefully scrutinize family lineages, examine property deeds, and assess the health and reputation of the prospective spouses. Contracts, known as marriage agreements or settlements, were drawn up specifying the dowry, the dower, any inheritance provisions, and the precise terms of the alliance. These documents were meticulously crafted, often with clauses addressing potential disputes, ensuring that the union served the long-term interests of both families. The individuals themselves might not even meet until shortly before the wedding ceremony, or sometimes not until the day itself. When they did meet, it was a formal affair, often supervised, with little room for personal interaction. For the individuals entering these arranged marriages, the experience could range from quiet resignation to genuine despair. Imagine being promised to a stranger, sometimes from a foreign land, whose language you might not speak, whose customs you might not understand. You would enter their household as an outsider, your primary purpose to bear children and solidify the alliance. Yet, within these constraints, some couples did find companionship, respect, and even a quiet affection over time. But the initial foundation was always one of duty, a calculated step to maintain or elevate the family's standing in a highly competitive and often brutal world. This strategic foundation, built on land, wealth, and power rather than personal preference, set the stage for all the rituals and rules that would follow, especially those surrounding the wedding itself, and most particularly the crucial wedding night. If the medieval marriage was a carefully constructed alliance, then its very foundation rested upon a crucial, often prolonged stage that came long before any formal ceremony, the betrothal. You see, the wedding itself was merely the public confirmation of a promise already made, a pact often forged years, sometimes even decades, in advance. This betrothal, known in Latin as sponsalia, was not a casual agreement. It was a legally binding contract, a solemn vow exchanged between families, typically the fathers or guardians of the prospective bride and groom. This was a time when the future of entire lineages, the fate of vast estates, and the stability of fragile kingdoms hung upon such arrangements. The betrothal served as the moment when the core terms of the union were meticulously negotiated and agreed upon. This included the dowry, the wealth or property the bride's family would bring to the marriage, which was intended to support her and her children and, crucially, to provide for her if she became a widow, ensuring her financial security throughout her life. It also involved the bride price, a payment from the groom's family to the bride's, a custom more prevalent in earlier Germanic traditions, gradually fading in some regions, but still signifying the value placed on the bride and her family's contribution. These financial details were not mere footnotes. They were the very sinews of the agreement, often recorded on parchment with the careful scratch of a quill, meticulously documented and sealed with wax, binding the parties in a tangible way. The chill of the stone hall where such negotiations took place often mirrored the cool, calculating nature of the discussions. The age of the betrothed often surprises modern sensibilities, while the Church, through its evolving canon law, set minimum ages for a valid marriage, typically 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Betrothals frequently involved children, far younger. It was not uncommon for infants, barely out of swaddling clothes, to be formally promised to one another. Imagine a child who had not yet learned to speak, whose future was already laid out, entwined with another's, through the foresight and ambition of their elders. These very early betrothals were particularly common among the nobility and royalty, where securing advantageous unions as early as possible prevented rival families from snatching up desirable matches. It ensured that, by the time the children reached marriageable age, their destiny was already sealed, a predetermined path preventing any awkward personal preferences or fleeting youthful affections from interfering with the larger strategic necessities of family and power. The legal weight of a betrothal was profound. Once solemnized, it created a relationship known as spiritual affinity between the families, a bond that carried implications for future marriages within those kin groups. Breaking a betrothal was not a simple matter of changing one's mind. It carried severe consequences. The offending party, or their family, could face substantial financial penalties, often losing the dowry or bride price already exchanged or promised, a significant blow to their economic standing. Beyond the monetary repercussions, there was the devastating impact on reputation, a stain that could be difficult, if not impossible, to wash away in the hierarchical society of the time. This reputational damage could extend beyond the immediate family, sometimes affecting alliances between entire noble houses or even kingdoms. The betrothal ceremony itself, while less elaborate than the wedding, was still a public declaration. It often involved the exchange of rings, particularly a ring for the finger of the future bride, symbolizing the commitment. Sometimes a kiss was exchanged, not as a sign of personal affection, but as a formal, symbolic gesture cementing the agreement, a public affirmation of the bond. Witnesses were crucial, often prominent members of the community or noble court, whose presence lent legitimacy and ensured that the agreement was widely known and accepted. This public aspect was vital, for it served to inform the wider community of the impending union, solidifying its standing and deterring any other suitors. The gleam of a newly exchanged ring on a young hand, though perhaps not fully understood by its wearer, shone as a beacon of a future already meticulously charted and set in motion by the elders. It is important to understand that while the betrothal was binding, it was distinct from the actual marriage. The betrothal was a promise de futuro, a commitment to marry in the future. The marriage itself, the matrimonium, was the consummation of that promise, an act de presenti, a present and ongoing state. This distinction was critical in medieval canon law, which was the body of ecclesiastical law governing various aspects of life, including marriage. The Church viewed marriage as a sacrament, a sacred bond, and thus placed strict rules on its formation and dissolution. While a betrothal could theoretically be broken under certain circumstances, such as a discovery of a pre-existing impediment, or by mutual consent and penalty, the legal avenues for dissolving an actual marriage were far more restricted, often requiring proof of non-consummation or a pre-existing undiscovered impediment. The legal framework surrounding betrothals also allowed for disputes and legal challenges. If one party felt the other was dragging their feet or attempting to renege on the agreement, they could appeal to ecclesiastical courts. These courts, administered by the church, held significant power over marital matters. They could compel a party to honor their betrothal or assess damages for its breach. Imagine the tension in those courtrooms, the weight of family honor and financial stakes hanging in the balance, as lawyers argued over the precise wording of a betrothal contract or the interpretation of a sacred vow. The outcome of such cases could determine the trajectory of generations. In essence, the betrothal served as the unshakable cornerstone of the medieval marital structure. It was the planning stage, the contractual phase, ensuring that the grand edifice of a family alliance stood firm before the first stone of the wedding ceremony was even laid. It was a formal declaration of intent, a public commitment that bound individuals and families together, often long before personal sentiment could even begin to form. These promises, made in the often austere settings of feudal castles or manor houses, shaped destinies, determined successions, and laid the groundwork for the intricate web of familial and political relationships that defined the medieval world. The wedding, therefore, was not the true beginning of the story, but rather a grand public affirmation of a narrative that had already been meticulously written and agreed upon in the quiet, yet profoundly powerful, act of betrothal. This comprehensive groundwork ensured that when the time for the wedding ceremony finally arrived, it was a smooth, well-orchestrated transition, moving from a promise to a binding reality. After the betrothal, that solemn promise exchanged, the next critical step in a medieval union was the wedding ceremony itself, a moment not of private sentiment, but of profound public declaration. It was here, before the eyes of the community, that two lives were formally joined, and the intricate threads of property, lineage, and social standing were visibly woven together. Imagine, if you will, the scene. The sun, perhaps bright and clear, or perhaps diffused by soft cloud, casting its light upon the gathering. The air might have held the scent of damp earth, or in warmer months, the fragrance of early blossoms. This was not typically a ceremony hidden within the hushed sanctity of the church's main altar, as we might picture it today. Instead, the most vital part, the legal and binding declaration, often unfolded at the very threshold of the sacred building, specifically at the church door or within its open porch. This was a deliberate choice, born of practicality and legal necessity. The open space ensured that all who wished to see could witness the union, that no one could later claim ignorance of the marriage or dispute its legitimacy. The assembled villagers and noble guests, dressed in their best, would have formed a quiet throng, their collective gaze fixed upon the bride and groom. A priest, perhaps the local parson or a more esteemed cleric, would officiate, but his role at this initial stage was often more akin to a legal witness and a spiritual overseer than the central figure of an elaborate ritual. The true power of this moment lay in its public nature. The couple would stand before the priest and the assembled witnesses, often with their families close by, a physical representation of the alliance being forged. Here, at the church door, the formal vows were exchanged. These were not always the romantic declarations we associate with modern weddings, but rather direct, contractual statements. The man would declare his intention to take the woman as his wife, and she, in turn, would accept him as her husband. This simple exchange, witnessed by the community, carried immense legal weight. It was here that the groom might formally present the bride with a ring, a visible symbol of their new bond, and perhaps other tokens, such as gold or silver, signifying his commitment to her and her future well-being. The joining of hands was another powerful gesture, a physical manifestation of the spiritual and legal union. These were ancient customs, echoing practices that predated formal church doctrine, rooted in the need for public acknowledgement and social acceptance. Beyond the vows, the ceremony at the church door also served as the crucial point for the formalization of property transfers. The dowry, that portion of wealth or property brought by the bride from her family to the marriage, was often publicly acknowledged here. Similarly, the dower, the provision made by the groom for his wife's future maintenance should she become a widow, would be confirmed. These were not mere financial transactions. They were fundamental to the economic stability of the new household and to the security of both families involved. Documents might be read or agreements verbally confirmed, ensuring that the legal aspects of the union were as transparent and undeniable as the vows themselves. The presence of witnesses was paramount. Their collective memory and testimony would serve as an unbreakable record, vital in an age where written contracts, though increasingly common, could still be challenged or lost. Should any dispute arise in the future regarding the legitimacy of the children or the rightful inheritance of property, these witnesses, who had stood at the church door, would be called upon to affirm what they had seen and heard. Once these essential public and legal formalities were concluded at the church door, the procession would typically move inside the church. This transition marked a shift from the secular contractual aspect of the marriage to its more sacred and spiritual dimension. Inside, a nuptial mass would often be celebrated, offering prayers and blessings for the newly wedded couple. Here, the union received the church's blessing, solidifying its spiritual legitimacy in the eyes of God. The atmosphere inside would be more solemn, filled with the scent of incense and the quiet murmurs of prayer. The priest would now take a more prominent role, offering homilies on the sanctity of marriage and the duties of husband and wife, reminding them of the spiritual obligations that accompanied their earthly bond. After the Mass, the newly married couple, now formally bound in both worldly and divine spheres, would emerge to a chorus of well wishes and celebratory sounds. A joyous procession would often form, leading them from the church to the feast that awaited. This feast was another integral part of the medieval wedding celebration, a grand communal meal that further cemented the union within the social fabric. It was a time for merriment, for music, for dancing, and for the consumption of rich foods and fine drink, often continuing late into the day and evening. The community's participation in this celebration was not merely about enjoyment. It was a further ratification of the marriage, a collective embrace of the new couple into the established order of society. Gifts would be presented, toasts would be raised, and the air would be filled with a sense of shared festivity. Children might run about, their laughter adding to the joyous din, while older relatives would watch with knowing smiles, reflecting on their own wedding days and the continuation of their family lines. This entire sequence, from the public vows at the church door to the celebratory feast, was carefully orchestrated. Every step served a purpose: to declare the union, to legitimize the children who would follow, to secure the transfer of property, and to ensure the social acceptance of the new household. It was a ritual that underscored the medieval understanding of marriage not as a private declaration of love, but as a fundamental pillar of society, essential for stability, continuity, and the very structure of the feudal world. As the day drew to a close and the last of the celebratory toasts were made, the focus of the wedding night would begin to shift, moving from the broad public gaze to the more intimate yet still remarkably public journey to the bedchamber. The wedding ceremony, a momentous public declaration, concluded not with a private retreat for the newly joined couple, but with an equally significant, often boisterous, public spectacle. This was the journey to the bedchamber, an event widely known throughout medieval Europe as the bedding ceremony, or, more specifically, the bedding of the bride, and it formed an indispensable part of the medieval marital rites. It was not merely a transition from one space to another, marking the end of the day's festivities, but a deeply ritualized procession, a final, emphatic public affirmation of the union before its physical consummation. After the communal feasting, which could stretch for hours with numerous courses and endless libations, and the often lively dancing, which involved all strata of society present, the entire company of wedding guests, or at least a significant and influential portion of them, would rise to escort the newly married pair to their designated marital bedchamber. This was far from a quiet, intimate walk, hushed and respectful. Instead, it was typically a loud, boisterous, and immensely celebratory parade, reverberating with the sounds of musical instruments, perhaps lutes, pipes, or drums, joyous singing, and a hearty chorus of often ribald jests and well wishes directed at both the bride and the groom. The air would be thick with a tangible sense of anticipation, communal merriment, and a shared understanding of the weighty purpose behind the procession. The guests, particularly the senior women for the bride and the close male friends and relatives for the groom, would physically accompany them, cheering them on, and offering a mixture of sincere blessings for their future and explicitly suggestive advice for the night ahead, all delivered with an earthy frankness characteristic of the age. The purpose of this public escort was intricately multifaceted, reflecting the deep-seated concerns of medieval society regarding legitimacy, inheritance, and the very fabric of the social order, which was built upon stable family lines. Firstly, and perhaps most crucially from a legal standpoint, it served as a final, unequivocal public witness to the reality and legitimacy of the marriage. In an era where formal written records could be sparse, localized, or easily lost, and where disputes over lineage and property inheritance were common and often violent, the direct testimony of numerous reputable witnesses to the couple being formally put to bed together was invaluable. It established a clear, undeniable public record. This collective witnessing ensured that no foul play, such as a substitution of one spouse for another, could occur in the privacy of the chamber, and it visibly, undeniably ushered the couple into their new marital state, leaving no room for future doubt about the validity of their union in the eyes of the community and law. This was a physical manifestation of communal acceptance and validation. Beyond these pragmatic, legal, and social functions, there was a potent spiritual and deeply ingrained superstitious dimension to the bedding ceremony. It was widely believed that the powerful, joyous presence of well-wishers and the celebratory noise they created would serve as a robust shield against any malevolent spirits, mischievous fairies, or ill omens that might seek to harm the union. These unseen forces were thought capable of inflicting various woes, from preventing conception and causing barrenness to sowing discord and strife between the spouses, or even rendering the marriage physically unconsummated through impotence or frigidity. The collective positive energy, the boisterous clamor, and the sheer number of witnesses were seen as a spiritual barrier against such perceived threats, ensuring the couple could proceed to their consummation free from supernatural interference and with the blessings of the community. The bride, in particular, remained the intensely scrutinized focal point of much of this attention and ritual. Upon reaching the bedchamber, which might be a specially prepared room in the Lord's castle, or a more modest but equally significant space in a peasant home, she would often be formally undressed, not by her new husband in privacy, but by her female relatives, her bridesmaids, and her closest friends. This ritualistic shedding of her maiden status was a poignant, sometimes tearful, sometimes joyous moment, symbolizing her profound transition from girlhood to womanhood, from her father's protective household to her husband's, and from virginity to the expected role of a wife and mother. Articles of her clothing, such as her garters, stockings, or even pieces of her bridal veil, were frequently removed and then tossed among the eager guests waiting just outside or in the antechamber. These items were considered powerful tokens of good luck and fertility, highly sought after, especially by those hoping to marry soon themselves, with a particular emphasis on unmarried bridesmaids hoping to catch the next bouquet, or rather, the next garter, which promised they would be next to walk down the aisle. The groom, too, would be assisted by his male companions, often amidst much laughter, jocularity, and explicitly suggestive remarks, as they helped him prepare for the night ahead. This communal undressing further underscored the deeply public nature of the event and the community's profound investment in the marriage's immediate success and future fruitfulness. Once the couple was in the bedchamber, they would be formally placed in the bed itself. The bed, often elaborately decorated with fine linens, rich hangings, and sometimes even symbolically blessed by a priest or local elder, was far more than a mere piece of furniture. It was a potent central symbol of fertility, prosperity, and the future of the lineage, the very crucible where the next generation would be conceived. Sometimes the sheets would be warmed beforehand, a small practical comfort in the often cold and draughty medieval chambers, and drinks, frequently a spiced wine or ale known as posset, would be offered to the couple. These were not just for simple refreshment. They were often imbued with symbolic significance, believed to promote love, passion, or fertility, and sometimes contained ingredients thought to act as aphrodisiacs or to ensure conception. Before finally withdrawing and leaving the couple to their much-anticipated privacy, the assembled guests would offer their final blessings and fervent wishes for a fruitful union. These wishes were often delivered with a directness and lack of euphemism that modern sensibilities might find startling, explicitly encouraging the consummation of the marriage. The societal expectation was utterly clear and universally understood. The marriage was not truly complete, legally valid, or spiritually blessed until it had been physically consummated. This public sending off, with its boisterous energy, its ritualistic elements, and its communal witness, was the final climactic act of the public wedding celebrations. It was a crucial bridge between the formal, ceremonial declarations of the day and the profoundly important, yet ultimately private act that would legally and spiritually cement their bond, ensuring the legitimacy of any future heirs. Over the succeeding centuries, as societal norms shifted, as the concept of individual privacy gained a greater premium, and as religious and legal institutions became more formalized, these elaborate and often public wedding night customs gradually faded and transformed. The boisterous processions eventually gave way to more private and less ritualized transitions to the bedchamber. But in the medieval world, this spectacle was an indispensable chapter in the wedding narrative, a crucial, vibrant, and undeniably public step that led directly to the ultimate act of legitimization and the promise of future generations. It was a time when the boundaries between public life and private intimacy were far more permeable, and the community played an active, visible, and vocal role in even the most personal of life's transitions. The sounds of laughter, song, and well wishes would slowly recede as the door closed, leaving the couple to the quiet of their chamber and to the act that would truly bind them in the eyes of God, law, and lineage, ushering in the next stage of their shared destiny. After the last of the boisterous guests had finally departed, their laughter and well wishes fading into the quiet corridors of the castle or the hushed stillness of the family home, the newly married couple was left alone in the prepared bedchamber. The heavy oak door, perhaps recently adorned with ribbons or sprigs of fertility-enhancing herbs, would creak shut, sealing them off from the celebratory clamor outside. A profound silence would often settle, broken only by the crackle of a dying fire in the hearth, or the distant hoot of an owl echoing faintly from outside. But this newly found privacy was not for simple intimacy, as we might conceive of it today. Instead, it marked the beginning of perhaps the most profoundly significant and legally binding aspect of the entire medieval marriage process, the consummation. This act, far from being merely a personal and private union, was the absolute core of legitimacy in the medieval world. It was the moment that transformed a series of agreements, public declarations, and ceremonial blessings into an unbreakable, legally recognized, and spiritually complete bond. Without this physical union, the entire elaborate structure of betrothal, the transfer of dowry and dower, the public vows, and the accompanying festivities could, in theory, be undone, rendering the preceding days of elaborate preparation and significant expense utterly meaningless. The marriage, in the eyes of both secular law and the increasingly powerful canon law of the Church, remained incomplete, a potential nullity, a fragile pact awaiting its final, crucial seal. The primary, overwhelming reason for this absolute necessity lay in the very purpose of medieval marriage itself, the unquestionable production of legitimate heirs. In a society where power, wealth, and stability were inextricably linked to land ownership, inherited titles, and dynastic succession, the clarity of lineage was paramount. Noble houses, royal dynasties, and even prosperous peasant families relied on a clear, undisputed line of inheritance to ensure the continuation of their names, the preservation of their lands, and the perpetuation of their influence. The very fabric of society, from the highest throne to the humblest cottage, depended on predictable transfers of property and status. A child born outside of a consummated marriage or from a union that was later deemed unconsummated would be considered illegitimate. Such a child, regardless of affection or parentage, possessed no legal right to inherit titles, properties, or wealth. This vulnerability could plunge an entire region, a powerful family, or even a kingdom into devastating disarray, civil war, or succession crises that might last for generations. The stakes were incredibly high, transcending any personal feelings, romantic attachments, or even the immediate happiness of the individuals involved. The future of entire bloodlines, the stability of regions, and the very peace of nations hung precariously in the balance, making the consummation not just an expectation, but a profound, inescapable duty that weighed heavily on the shoulders of the young couple throughout that fateful night. The Church, in its ever-expanding reach and authority over daily life and moral conduct, further solidified the spiritual and legal gravity of consummation. While the vows exchanged during the wedding ceremony created a significant bond known as matrimonium initiatum, an initiated marriage, it was the physical union, the copula carnalis, that elevated it to matrimonium ratum et consummatum, a ratified and consummated marriage. This distinction was crucial in canon law. Until physical union occurred, a marriage, even if formally celebrated with all due pomp and circumstance, could be annulled more readily by the church courts. Such annulments might be granted on grounds of pre-existing impediments, such as undisclosed kinship, a prior unfulfilled vow of chastity, or indeed a lack of true uncoerced consent. Once consummated, however, the bond was understood to be truly unbreakable, reflecting the biblical concept of two becoming one flesh, a union that was now indissoluble in the eyes of God and man. This sacred and irrevocable union meant that the wedding night was not merely about beginning a family, it was about solidifying a pact that, in the eyes of God and man, would bind the couple for life, a bond that could only be dissolved by death. The weight of this spiritual commitment added another layer of solemnity and permanence to an already weighty occasion, transforming a public ceremony into an intimate yet equally public declaration of lasting commitment. For families of high status, particularly the nobility and royalty, the consummation was often surrounded by an unspoken yet pervasive expectation of proof. While direct witnessing of the act itself was rare and generally frowned upon by the church as indecorous, the morning after the wedding night, the bed sheets might subtly be inspected for telltale signs of the union. This practice, though varying in overtness and formality depending on the region, the specific era, and the social standing of the families involved, underscored the public nature of even this most private act. it was less about prurience and more about ensuring the undeniable legitimacy of any future offspring, leaving no room for doubt or challenge. In royal marriages, where alliances between kingdoms were forged and massive political implications rested on the birth of a clear, legitimate heir, the pressure on the young couple was immense. The bride, often a young woman, perhaps still a child, was burdened with the immense responsibility of fulfilling this duty. Her honor, her family's standing, and the entire future of her new house, perhaps even the stability of a nation, rested upon this single act. The quiet expectation, the weight of centuries of tradition, and the silent presence of unseen ancestors seemed to fill the bedchamber more profoundly than any physical furnishings. The candles might flicker, casting long dancing shadows on the cold stone walls of the chamber as the couple faced the solemn reality of their new life together, knowing that their union was now irrevocably sealed. The cool night air might carry the faint scent of old stone and fresh linen, a silent witness to the profound moment, while the consummation of marriage held immense legal and spiritual weight in the medieval world, essential for establishing legitimacy and securing inheritance for future generations. There is another, far more infamous and often misunderstood aspect associated with medieval wedding nights that frequently captures the imagination, the concept of droit du seigneur. This notorious phrase, often translated as the right of the Lord, or more dramatically as jus primae noctis, meaning right of the first night, conjures vivid, often disturbing images in the modern mind. It evokes a scene where a powerful feudal lord exercises a presumed privilege to sleep with a newlywed bride from his domain before her husband is permitted to do so. This notion is deeply embedded in popular culture, finding its way into countless works of fiction, historical dramas, and even academic discussions. Yet its true nature and historical prevalence in the Middle Ages are far more nuanced and, in many ways, significantly less dramatic and sensational than the myth suggests. The idea of a lord possessing a widespread physical right to deflower a peasant bride on her wedding night is, for the most part, a pervasive myth. This myth was greatly amplified and sensationalized by later writers and propagandists, particularly during periods of intense social and political upheaval, such as the Enlightenment and during the French Revolution. In these contexts, tales of a lord's physical jus primae noctis served as incredibly potent and effective propaganda. They were carefully crafted narratives designed to demonize the aristocracy and expose the perceived abuses and moral depravity of the feudal system. The aim was to paint the nobility as tyrannical, oppressive, and morally corrupt, thereby justifying revolutionary fervor and the dismantling of the old order. These accounts, while powerful in their political impact, often bore little resemblance to historical practice. In the intricate tapestry of medieval legal and social customs, if such a right existed at all, it was almost universally symbolic in nature. It manifested as a form of feudal tax, a financial due, or a ritualistic payment, rather than an actual physical act of sexual intrusion. Extensive historical records, including charters, legal documents, and manorial accounts from across various European regions, provide remarkably little concrete evidence to support the widespread physical enforcement of jus primae noctis. Instead, What scholars consistently find are numerous references to payments known by various Latin terms, such as culegium, marchetta, or other regional vernacular equivalents. These were, in essence, fees paid by a serf or a vassal to their feudal lord specifically upon marriage. The underlying rationale for these payments stemmed directly from the lord's overarching rights over the land, and, by extension, over the people who resided on that land, particularly serfs who were legally tied to the soil and constituted a significant part of the lord's economic assets. When a serf entered into marriage, especially if they chose a spouse from outside the lord's specific domain or manor, or even simply by choosing to marry at all, it represented a significant change in the lord's potential workforce and had implications for his property rights over his dependents. A marriage could potentially reduce the available labor for the lord's fields, or it could complicate the inheritance of serfdom and the associated obligations. Therefore, the payment of marchetta or culegium was fundamentally a form of compensation to the lord, or more accurately, a formal recognition of his overarching authority and proprietary rights. It served as a fee for the lord's official consent to the marriage or for the right of the couple to marry and form a new household without the lord's direct and absolute interference. It was a transaction that affirmed the lord's suzerainty over his subjects' lives and their major life events. The exact form of this payment could vary considerably depending on the region, the specific manner, and the local customs that had evolved over centuries. It might be a direct sum of money, a specific and agreed-upon item of value, such as a head of livestock, a pig, a cow, or a flock of chickens, a certain measure of grain from the harvest, or even a specific service owed to the Lord. In some exceptionally rare instances, historical documents hint at a symbolic gesture that represented the Lord's theoretical right, which was then immediately redeemed or bought off by a payment. For example, a local custom might stipulate that a lord had the right to symbolically pass his leg over the threshold of the bridal chamber or even over the marriage bed itself. This gesture, intended as a symbolic assertion of his authority over the union, would then be immediately nullified by a monetary payment from the groom or the family. It is precisely these kinds of symbolic acts, misinterpreted and exaggerated over time, that likely fueled the later, more lurid narratives of physical sexual rights. The symbolic act was later conflated with a literal one, transforming a feudal due into a tale of sexual exploitation. Furthermore, the powerful influence of the Church during the Middle Ages provides another compelling argument against the widespread physical enforcement of jus primae noctis. As we have previously discussed, the Church progressively asserted greater control over marriage laws and established it as a sacred sacrament. The Church doctrine vehemently emphasized the sanctity of marriage, the crucial importance of free and uncoerced consent between both spouses, and the exclusive conjugal rights of the husband to his wife. Any lord attempting to physically interfere with the consummation of a marriage, particularly in the intimate and personal act of the first night, would have been in direct and flagrant violation of core church doctrine and the very essence of the sacrament of matrimony. Ecclesiastical courts, which were highly influential and handled a vast array of marriage disputes, would have found such a practice not only morally abhorrent, but also legally indefensible and subject to severe penalties. Therefore, any lord who might have dared to physically enforce such a right would have faced not only the profound moral outrage of the local community and the potential resistance of the families involved, but also the very powerful and organized opposition of the church, an institution whose authority often rivaled or even surpassed that of secular rulers in matters of personal morality and law. While the notion of droit du seigneur as a widespread physical right is largely a product of later imaginative storytelling, political agendas, and a romanticized view of feudal tyranny, it is crucial to understand why such a potent myth took root and persisted so stubbornly in popular consciousness. The story, despite its lack of historical basis in a physical sense, spoke to deeper anxieties and resentments regarding the immense power and control that feudal lords wielded over the lives of their common subjects. The image of the lord asserting such a brutal and intimate right over his dependents resonated powerfully with broader narratives of oppression, injustice, and the vulnerability of the common people under the hierarchical feudal system, even if the historical reality was far more mundane, typically involving merely a tax or a fee. The sensational tale of the first night thus became a powerful and enduring symbol of aristocratic tyranny, a dark legend that continues to be retold and believed, often without the necessary and nuanced historical context that reveals its true nature. Therefore, while the medieval wedding night was indeed permeated with public rituals, significant social customs, and profound legal implications, the most sensational and controversial of its supposed rules, the droit du seigneur, was, in almost all historically verifiable instances, a bureaucratic transaction. It was a payment made to a feudal lord in recognition of his authority and rights over his land and people, rather than a physical intrusion into the most intimate moments of a newly formed union. It was a symbol of feudal authority, yes, but not in the lurid, sexually exploitative way it has been portrayed in popular lore. This distinction is vital for understanding the true complexities of medieval life, allowing us to move beyond exaggerated and often misleading folklore to grasp the more intricate realities of law, custom, and the ever-present balance of power between lord and subject in a deeply hierarchical society. The wedding night, as you have learned, was fraught with expectations, rituals. The previous night, we spoke of the critical importance of consummation, the physical union that was meant to solidify a medieval marriage, not just in the eyes of God, but also in the intricate legal frameworks of the time. This act, so personal and yet so public in its implications, was not merely a formality. It was the bedrock upon which the entire structure of a marital alliance rested. It was essential, above all else, for the production of legitimate heirs and the secure transfer of property, ensuring the continuity of family lines and the preservation of wealth across generations. If this foundational act did not occur, if the physical union remained unfulfilled, the marriage itself could be called into question, leading to a complex and often devastating process known as annulment. It is crucial to understand that an annulment in the Middle Ages was distinct from a modern divorce. A divorce, as we know it today, dissolves an existing marriage, acknowledging its prior validity. An annulment, by contrast, declared that the marriage had never truly existed in the first place, or at least that it was null and void from its very inception, as if it had never happened. This distinction carried immense and far-reaching weight, particularly for the children born of such a union. If a marriage was annulled, any children previously considered legitimate could suddenly find their status challenged, potentially losing their inheritance, their noble titles, and their very place within society. The implications were not just personal, they were dynastic, affecting the stability of entire families and their positions within the feudal hierarchy. The most common and accepted ground for seeking an annulment was, as we have touched upon, the inability to consummate the marriage. This usually centered on the physical incapacity of one of the spouses to engage in sexual intercourse, often referred to as impotence for men or frigidity for women. The Church, which wielded immense moral and legal authority over all aspects of life, including marital law, viewed procreation as one of the primary and sacred purposes of marriage, a divine command to be fruitful and multiply. If this fundamental purpose could not be fulfilled due to a physical impediment, the union was deemed fundamentally flawed, lacking an essential element that made it a true and binding sacrament in the eyes of God and the law. Proving impotence or non-consummation, however, was a delicate, deeply intrusive, and often profoundly humiliating affair. It was not enough for one spouse simply to claim the other was unable or unwilling. The ecclesiastical courts, which handled these matters, demanded rigorous proof. The process usually involved detailed testimonies, often from servants, family members, or even neighbors who had been privy to the couple's private life or who could attest to their separate sleeping arrangements. Imagine the discomfort, the profound invasion of privacy, the sheer public scrutiny forced upon individuals in such circumstances, all to satisfy the legal requirements of an era that demanded tangible, observable evidence for even the most intimate aspects of human existence. The very concept of personal privacy, as we understand it today, was a fragile and often non-existent luxury in the face of such legal demands. In some cases, and this is where the procedures became truly extraordinary and ethically questionable, physical examinations by midwives or even physicians were ordered by the church courts. These examinations were conducted to ascertain the physical state of the individuals involved, to look for any anatomical impediments that might prevent consummation. The details of these examinations would then be presented as evidence in open court, further stripping the individuals of their dignity. It was a stark and uncomfortable reminder that the private lives of individuals, especially those of noble or royal blood, were never truly their own. They were always subject to the scrutiny and judgment of the wider community and its governing institutions. There were even more extreme methods, though these were controversial, widely criticized for their indecency, and eventually largely abandoned by the Church due to their inherent unreliability and moral repugnance. One such method was the infamous Congress test, where the couple might be ordered to attempt consummation in the presence of witnesses, or at least within earshot of court-appointed observers. While this practice was exceedingly rare and often condemned as a violation of both decency and spiritual integrity, its very existence highlights the desperate and often bizarre lengths to which medieval legal systems would go to determine the validity of a marriage and, by extension, the legitimacy of a potential lineage. It was a grim and unsettling testament to how little personal autonomy was granted when the stakes were as high as dynastic succession, the transfer of vast estates, or the continuation of a royal line. Beyond genuine physical impediments, the claim of non-consummation could also become a highly convenient and potent tool in the intricate and often ruthless game of medieval politics and power. Royal and noble marriages, as we have discussed, were fundamentally about forging and maintaining alliances between powerful families, kingdoms, and duchies. If a political alliance soured, if a more advantageous match presented itself, or if a ruling monarch desired a new queen to produce a male heir, powerful families or monarchs might strategically seek an annulment on grounds of non-consummation, even if the marriage had, in fact, been consummated in full. The Church, while theoretically independent and committed to spiritual purity, was often deeply influenced by the powerful patrons who supported it, the kings and nobles whose piety and wealth sustained its institutions. In such high-stakes cases, proving non-consummation might become less a matter of medical fact or divine law and more a matter of strategic maneuver, diplomatic pressure, or the promise of political favors, twisting the intimate details of a couple's life into a weapon for political and dynastic gain. A famous example illustrates this perfectly. King Louis XII of France, desiring to marry Anne of Brittany for her strategically important duchy and to secure the future of his kingdom, successfully sought an annulment of his marriage to Jeanne of France. While Jeanne was known to have a physical deformity, the timing and urgency of the annulment were undeniably linked to Louis's pressing political and territorial ambitions. The Church's verdict in such high-profile cases could be swayed by diplomatic pressure or the promise of political favors, making the application of marital law less about abstract divine will and more about tangible earthly power and the very real necessities of statecraft. The immense weight placed on consummation, therefore, profoundly underscores the medieval worldview, where marriage was not merely a romantic union, a partnership of hearts, but an indispensable societal contract with tangible responsibilities and unwavering expectations. The wedding night, far from being a purely private celebration of nascent love, was a critical legal proving ground, a moment pregnant with the future of families, the disposition of lands, and even the stability of kingdoms. The ever-present possibility of annulment, lurking in the shadows of non-consummation, served as a stark and constant reminder that even after the vows were exchanged, the rings placed, and the grand feast concluded, the union was still provisional, still incomplete, until its most fundamental and legally recognized purpose had been unequivocally fulfilled. It was a complex system that, in its relentless pursuit of lineage, property, and dynastic continuity, often placed the collective good of the family or state above the individual dignity and privacy of its members. This legal framework, with its exacting demands for proof and its profound consequences, shaped not only the lives of medieval couples, but also the very fabric of their society, demonstrating how deeply intertwined the most personal acts were with the grand narratives of power and history. The silence of the bedchamber, in this context, was never truly silent. It always carried the unspoken echoes of legal scrutiny and societal expectation indeed, Beyond the legal intricacies and the Church's strict doctrines, the medieval mind was also deeply rooted in a world of popular belief, ancient superstitions, and the lingering echoes of pagan practices. While the Church codified marriage and its legitimacy through ceremonies and pronouncements, the common people, often living in close communion with nature and its unpredictable rhythms, sought to influence their fate and ensure the success of their union through a myriad of rituals that often predated Christian teachings. The wedding night, being the culmination of the marriage process and the moment of procreation, was particularly rich with these customs, born of a profound human desire to ensure continuity, ward off malevolent spirits, and secure good fortune for the newlyweds. The very act of forming a new family, of bringing new life into the world, was seen as a vulnerable passage, requiring every possible safeguard and deep ancestral wisdom. You see, the primary and most pressing anxiety surrounding the wedding night, beyond the legal consummation that ensured legitimacy, was the ever-present fear of barrenness. In an age of high infant mortality and a constant need for robust labor, a marriage without children, especially sons to carry on the family name and inherit property, was often seen as incomplete, a profound failure not only for the couple themselves, but for the lineage, the family's future, and the wider community. To combat this deeply felt anxiety, many rituals centered on the potent symbolism of abundance and growth, directly invoking the earth's natural fertility and the blessings of unseen forces. It was common, for instance, for guests to joyfully throw grains or nuts, such as rice, wheat, barley, or even small coins, over the couple as they left the church, or, more frequently, as they triumphantly entered their new home. This joyous scattering was not merely a festive gesture, it was a direct, heartfelt invocation of fertility, mimicking the scattering of seeds for a plentiful harvest and wishing the couple a similar bounty of offspring for their home. In some regions, a piece of special bread, often a richly baked cake, would be ceremonially broken over the bride's head, symbolizing a wish for her to be as fruitful and abundant as the very earth that yields the grain. The crumbs from this bread would then be eagerly collected by the wedding guests, particularly unmarried women, as a potent charm, believed to bring them their own future marriages and, crucially, their own children. The very act of consuming these crumbs was thought to transfer the essence of fertility and marital bliss. Another widespread and deeply symbolic practice, intended to ensure a thriving lineage, involved placing a young, healthy child, preferably a boy, to symbolize the desired male heir, upon the marital bed before the couple retired for the night. This was far more than a charming gesture. It was a powerful symbolic act, believed to transfer the child's vibrant vitality, innocence, and inherent fertility to the bed itself, ensuring the speedy arrival and healthy growth of many sons and daughters for the new couple. The very presence of youthful innocence was thought to bless the bed and consecrate it for the sacred act of procreation. Sometimes the bed itself would be meticulously prepared with specific herbs known for their procreative properties, or with small charms hidden within the mattress or beneath the pillows, all explicitly intended to promote fertility, ease childbirth, or protect against ill wishes that might hinder conception. The linen sheets might be infused with fragrant herbal scents or embroidered with symbols of life and abundance, further enhancing their protective qualities. The threat of evil spirits was another pervasive and terrifying concern that shaped wedding night rituals. In the medieval worldview, the boundaries between the seen and unseen were often blurred, and it was widely believed that envious spirits, malevolent fairies, or even witches might try to interfere with the marriage, causing impotence, barrenness, or general misfortune. The newlyweds, especially on such a pivotal night, were considered particularly vulnerable to these unseen dangers. To ward off these malicious entities, noise was often employed with great gusto. The boisterous procession accompanying the couple to the bedchamber, known as the bedding ceremony, with its loud singing, raucous shouting, playful jests, and energetic music from pipes, drums, and fiddles, served not only as a joyous celebration, but as a deliberate cacophony designed to scare away any lurking evil. Bells, with their clear, piercing sound, were rung incessantly, their vibrations believed to cleanse the air of negative influences. In some areas, particularly in rural communities, even a gun might be fired into the air or a loud firecracker set off, aiming to create a sudden, sharp report intended to startle and drive away any malevolent presence. Specific herbs known for their protective qualities, such as rue, dill, garlic, or St. John's wort, were often strewn about the bedchamber, hung over the doorway, or even carefully woven into the couple's wedding clothing, acting as a botanical shield. Iron objects, like a horseshoe nailed above the door, a small piece of iron beneath the bed, or even a simple nail, were also placed strategically near the bed, as iron was universally believed to possess potent apotropaic powers, repelling malevolent forces and ensuring the safety of the couple. The marriage bed itself might be blessed with holy water by a priest or an elder, or salt, another powerful protective substance, might be sprinkled around it, creating a spiritual barrier against harm. Beyond ensuring fertility and providing protection from dark influences, rituals also aim to bring general good fortune and lasting harmony to the marriage. The bride's first steps into her new home, or her husband's home, were often observed with intense scrutiny, as they were believed to foretell the very nature of her life there. She might be carried over the threshold by her husband, a custom that persists even today in many cultures, partly to prevent her from stumbling, which was considered a dire ill omen for the marriage's stability, and partly to symbolically mark her new passage and acceptance into his domestic domain. Specific days of the week were considered more auspicious for a wedding than others, with Friday often being avoided due to its association with bad luck, while Sunday or Tuesday were often preferred. The precise timing of the consummation itself might even be influenced by astrological beliefs, lunar cycles, or the advice of local wise women, all seeking the most propitious moment. The elaborate and often highly public rituals surrounding medieval wedding nights, from the communal procession to the symbolic bedding ceremonies and the myriad superstitions, were deeply embedded in the societal fabric of their time. They served crucial functions, ensuring legitimacy, securing inheritance, and reinforcing community bonds in an era where such matters were paramount and often precarious. Yet, as the centuries turned, the tapestry of these customs began to subtly, almost imperceptibly, unravel, giving way to an increasing emphasis on privacy and a less overtly performative approach to the sacred union. This transformation was not a sudden decree, but a slow, organic evolution, spanning from the late Middle Ages into the early modern period. Several powerful currents converged to reshape these ancient practices. One of the most significant was the gradual shift in social norms themselves. As societies became more complex, moving from purely agrarian, tightly knit village communities to increasingly urbanized centers with more diverse populations, the intense communal oversight of private lives began to naturally diminish. The rigid social structures of feudalism, which often tied individuals directly to their lord and land, slowly gave way to different forms of social organization. With this loosening of traditional bonds, the immediate, pressing need for such overt public declarations of a marriage's legitimacy lessened. While the community's watchful eye was still present, of course, the intense, almost theatrical scrutiny of the wedding night itself began to recede. People, even in hierarchical societies, slowly started to value personal space and privacy more, not just for the elite, but across different social strata. The very idea of the home as a private sanctuary, a distinct and personal domain, rather than merely an extension of the public sphere, began to take root, however slowly and subtly. This growing emphasis on the individual and the private sphere was a profound cultural shift that touched every aspect of life, including the most intimate. The Church, which had initially been a key enforcer of the consummation's importance for legitimacy, also played a complex and often contradictory role in this evolution. While it continued to stress the spiritual and legal necessity of the marital act for a valid union and the production of legitimate heirs, its evolving doctrines also subtly encouraged a greater sense of modesty and a less boisterous, more solemn approach to marriage. The Council of Trent in the 16th century, for example, solidified the Church's role in marriage ceremonies, moving them more definitively into the sacred space of the church building, rather than the secular spaces where many medieval weddings occurred. This shift gradually pulled the focus away from the more pagan-influenced or purely secular rituals that often accompanied the wedding night. As the concept of marriage as a spiritual covenant between two individuals, blessed by God, gained more prominence, the boisterous, almost carnival-like atmosphere of the bedding ceremony started to feel increasingly out of place. The very notion of the nuptial chamber as a place of intimate union, a space of spiritual and emotional connection, rather than a mere stage for public affirmation, began to take hold. This increased emphasis on the sacredness and personal nature of the bond inherently reduced the need for communal, physical verification. Furthermore, the very nature of marriage itself underwent a gradual, albeit profound, redefinition. While strategic alliances for land, wealth, and power remained absolutely central for the aristocracy for many more centuries, a growing, if often unspoken, and certainly not universal, recognition of personal affection, companionship, and shared domesticity began to seep into the understanding of marital bonds. This was particularly evident among the rising merchant classes, who often married within their own social circles for business connections, but also increasingly sought a partner with whom they could build a stable household. Later, this sentiment also spread within the gentry, and even, to a limited extent, among the nobility. When a marriage was seen, even partially, as a partnership founded on some degree of personal connection and emotional compatibility, The need for external validation through public spectacle diminished significantly. The intimate moments of the wedding night became less about proving a legal fact to the community and more about the private beginning of a shared life, a foundation upon which a family unit would be built in quiet privacy. The decline of the bedding ceremony is a prime example of this shift away from public performance towards private intimacy. What was once a boisterous procession of guests, sometimes including strangers, accompanying the couple to their bedchamber, often offering bawdy advice and ensuring the act took place, gradually transformed over generations. First, it became a more restrained affair, limited only to very close family members and trusted attendants. Then, as sensibilities changed and privacy became more valued, it receded entirely behind closed doors, becoming a truly private moment between the newlyweds. The symbolic acts of formally putting the couple to bed or throwing stockings for good luck either disappeared completely or morphed into more discreet, less intrusive gestures performed only by the closest of kin. This profound shift from communal observation to private intimacy reflected a broader societal move away from a purely collective identity towards a more individualized understanding of family and personal life, paving the way for the modern concept of marital privacy. Even the ancient superstitions, which had sought to ward off evil or ensure fertility through specific rituals performed on the wedding night, underwent a similar transformation. They did not vanish entirely, but rather retreated from the public eye. What might have once been a communal ritual performed by the entire village or household became a private prayer, a small charm hidden beneath the mattress, or a quiet family tradition passed down through generations. The loud, overt displays of magical thinking gave way to more personal, internalized forms of belief. The fear of malevolent spirits or ill omens remained, but the methods of appeasement became more subtle, reflecting a gradual move towards a more rationalistic worldview, even as traditional beliefs continued to hold sway in different forms. By the 18th and 19th centuries, many of the medieval wedding night customs would have seemed utterly alien and uncouth to those living in polite society. The grand public spectacles had been replaced by more refined private celebrations. The focus had shifted from the communal validation of the union to the intimate bond between the bride and groom and the quiet dignity of their new shared life. Yet the echoes of these ancient practices lingered in subtle ways. In the continued emphasis on a honeymoon, a period of private union, in the societal expectation of legitimate heirs, and in the enduring symbolic weight of the marriage bed as the foundation of a family. The story of medieval wedding night rules is not merely a collection of strange or archaic facts. It is a testament to how profoundly society shapes our most intimate moments, how public life once intersected directly with private lives, and how the values of an age are reflected even in the rituals of love and new beginnings. As you drift into sleep, consider how much has changed, and yet how some fundamental human desires for companionship, for family, for a sense of belonging remain timeless, transcending the centuries and the peculiar customs they once held. The quiet of your own night now beckons, a privacy that was once a distant dream for those long ago.